Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Would you please welcome back to the Nixon Library our and President Nixon's great good friend, Bruce Herschensohn. My name is John Taylor. I'm Executive Director of the Nixon Foundation. I welcome you on behalf of our distinguished chairman. Would you please greet Chris Elfman? Hello, Chris, and welcome. For Chris and Kathy and Sandy and all of us at the Nixon Library and me, there is no greater pleasure, no more heartwarming exercise than welcoming Bruce Herschensohn. And so, as to delay the pleasure as long as possible, just a couple of announcements on behalf of us here at the Nixon Foundation. Please keep us in your plans for 4th of July weekend, which is hapfully a period of 3 days that includes the 4th of July this year. We're right into the time when we're going to have it on a Friday, so we will have a proper weekend. We're going to have patriotic music all weekend long. On the day itself, Friday the 4th of July at 1 o'clock, the wonderful Placentia Concert Band will be here at the library. At 2 o'clock on Saturday, the Riverside Concert Band. 2 o'clock on Sunday, the Huntington Beach Concert Band, and George Washington will be here to greet you on the 4th of July as usual. With the indispensable leadership of Mr. Elfman, we have forged a relationship with the Pacific Symphony, and we're going to have a series of musical evenings in the White House East Room beginning November 3rd, and then in January, and then in May, featuring a dinner and then the wonderful, wonderful performances by our wonderful colleagues from the Pacific Symphony, bless you, under the leadership of Mr. St. Clair himself. They did this same deal at the Performing Arts Center this year. Tickets are already sold out. This is why. If you're not already a member of the, bless you, the member, Louise, Hubert Perry of the Nixon Library Board. Louise is the sneezer. Welcome. Good to have you here, my friend. To make sure that you learn about this in time, be sure to be a member of the Nixon Library. Many of you already are. If you're a member of the Nixon Library, would you please raise your hands? You guys are great. I thank you. Let's thank them for their support. For as little as $50, you can be a member of the Associates Club and always get advance word of everything that's happening at the Nixon Library. And please do remember our free Sunday concerts every Sunday at 2 o'clock. We've got the Orange Empire Barbershop Chorus coming up this coming Sunday. Bruce Herschensohn, filmmaker. Some of the work he did at USIA was part of the corpus of work that won an Academy Award in the late 1960s. And his documentary about John F. Kennedy, Years of Lightning, Days of Drums, was in preparation in November 1963. Obviously, it changed markedly as a result of the tragedy at Dallas, and it took a special act of Congress to enable Bruce's work to be shown in the United States, because most USIA, if not all of it, film work at that time was not permitted to be shown in the United States. But Congress thought so much of Bruce's work, for which, incidentally, he also composed the score, that it passed a law enabling Americans to be able to see it at home. He served President Nixon in the White House. He is a teacher where his work has run the gamut from the John F. Kennedy School at Harvard to his current work now as a political science professor at Pepperdine, where he focuses on international relations, trying to get young students to put themselves inside the mind of presidents and national security advisors grappling with real crises that we face as a nation. He has been a television and radio commentator, twice a candidate for the United States Senate, and he has now written his 10th book and his second novel. And I have never read 208 pages into which there is more wisdom and poetry packed. This very well may be Bruce Herschensohn's masterpiece. So you've come prior to its national release, to have the opportunity to hear about it from its author and to have him sign it. It's a beautiful, beautiful book, and I don't want to give too much about it away. I find a lot of Bruce in the lead character, who is an acting president, a veteran diplomat in government service, who essentially saves the United States from a Muslim extremist revolution. The novel demonstrates two things about Bruce. First, his love of the stuff of American democracy, the way that it works, the procedures that keep us free. Second, his love of liberty and his love of freedom. Bruce is, of all of the things that you could describe him as, most important, he is a prophet of freedom. There's one thing that to him cannot, should not ever be compromised, is freedom and liberty. For Bruce, liberty always comes first. And at one of the many goosebump moments in this wonderful novel, which is called Above Empyrean, a novel of the final days of the war on Islamic terrorism, a fictional president, his voice crackling over the airwaves in a radio broadcast from the White House as government control by duly elected authorities is restored. This president says to his people, liberty is a God-given gift that all people receive at birth, and no government is entitled to steal his gift from those to whom it was given. Ladies and gentlemen, Bruce Herschensohn.
Thanks, and thanks for that beautiful introduction, John. Appreciate it so much. No matter what subject I talk about here at the Nixon Foundation, I always try to integrate something that President Nixon did or said that has current relevance, even if it has nothing at all to do with what I'm talking about. I just always try to do that if it's at all possible, and boy, was it possible this time. I'm more than acquainted with his 1974 State of the Union address, last State of the Union address he gave, January the 30th. And if you'll forgive me for reading, because I want to quote him with some precision, boy, as I said, was this ever relevant. This was from State of the Union, 1974. In all of the 186 State of the Union messages delivered from this place in our history, this is the first in which the first priority is energy. Last week, I sent to the Congress a comprehensive special message setting forth our energy situation, recommending the legislative measures which are necessary to a program for meeting our needs. I urge again that the energy measures that I've proposed to be made the first priority of this session of the Congress. Project Independence. Let this be our national goal. We will lay the foundation for our future capacity to meet America's energy needs from America's own resources. This is 34 years ago. At the end of this decade, in the year 1980, the United States will not be dependent on any other country for the energy we need to provide our jobs, to heat our homes, and to keep our transportation moving. We'll develop the new resources, the new technology, the new capacity America will require for its energy needs in the 1980s. That is just a measure of the magnitude of the project we're undertaking. 1974 must be the year in which we organize a full-scale effort to provide for our energy needs, not only in this decade, but through the 21st century. He gave that address trying to influence the 93rd Congress. We are now in the 110th Congress. None of them bought this. None of them. We're now in an election for the members of the Congress in the 111th Congress. Every Congress is 2 years. And keep in mind that presidents can demand, beg, And it really is up to the Congress in domestic affairs. There is a real difference. And I think very often American people are conned into thinking that presidents can do everything in domestic affairs. And they can do very, very little. Very little. In my opinion, after watching all of the election, the candidates' forums prior to New Hampshire, they started really the end of 2007, I would say, and I'm just estimating, there's nothing scientific, but just in watching them, about 80% of the discussion about things that presidents can't do. About 20% of the discussion, things that presidents can do. Presidents can do foreign policy. That is the stuff of a president. Foreign policy, military incursions, all of those things that pertain to the foreign affairs of the United States. That is the stuff of presidents. And I'm sorry for getting long, but I just have to tell you this. When President Kennedy had that terrible misfortune at the Bay of Pigs, very shortly after he got into office, he asked former Vice President Nixon to come and visit him in the Oval Office to talk about foreign affairs. Contrary to public belief, President Nixon, President Kennedy were very good friends. And so they had a meeting, and I got this from extremely good sources. I'll tell you who they were. One of them was President Nixon, one of them was Pierre Salinger. So I had both sides going on this incident that happened. President Nixon was seated in the Oval Office, and President Kennedy was pacing the floor. And they were discussing Cuba, Berlin, the Congo, Indonesia, India and Pakistan, South Vietnam and Laos, all of those places in the world that were current at the time in terms of what was needed by the United States or what we would do. And it went on for a considerable length of time. And President Kennedy stopped pacing, and he looked at former Vice President Nixon, and he said, "This is the stuff of presidents." Then he said, "Who cares if the minimum wage is $1.15 or $1.25? Now, he didn't really mean that he didn't care. He meant president isn't going to decide this anyway, so why talk about it? These are the things that presidents can do something about. I made this book, Above Empyrean, about the stuff of presidents, or in this case, an acting president, because it starts out with D.C. under combat and taken over by Muslim fundamentalist revolutionaries. And I'll just be very, very brief, because I just want to be very brief on this. There is a shelter for the surviving executive branch of government, and the president doesn't get there, nor does anyone get there in the line of succession. So the government has to be taken over by lower people in the spectrum of government. And there it becomes an acting president, which becomes the lead of the book, and others who were assistant secretaries and assistant directors and so on. And the entire purpose of the book, and the reason why I put it in a future framework, is that I want the reader, the voter, the Congress, the politicians, the Supreme Court for that matter, to see this period of history and the importance of winning this war, to see this period of history for the seriousness that it should be taken, and I don't believe that it is. We're at a war for the survival of the nation, for the survival of our people, and in a larger view, for the survival of civilization as we know it. And we better recognize it. Yet I hear polls on an everyday basis, because they're now taking polls every day, of what concerns Americans most. It's the economy, national health care, jobs, gasoline prices, environment. if we continue to put those things as number one, living in a pre-9/11 scale of importance, we're going to lose, because the other side doesn't regard anything as important except winning. And wars are either won or lost. And it is the purpose of this book. And I said to the voter, because I care about this, frankly, and I'll just be as candid as I can, I wrote this book in the hope that it would come out before the election. In fact, I geared it so that it would. I didn't know at the time that I was writing it who the candidates would be. Naturally, we all just found out, comparatively recently. I hoped it would be John McCain. And I want to tell you why I hoped it. Not because I agreed with him on everything, I didn't. But I felt, it's irrelevant. These things are irrelevant, the things that I disagreed with, in comparison with winning the war. And I felt he was one person who could win the war. He had foreign policy in his blood. He had the military in his blood. And he kept using the phrase, in contrast to so many others, that we have to win the war. He didn't say we have to end the war, as so many others, win the war. And I wanted it to be him. And it is him. And I want to make mention of one thing regarding his candidacy. He was doing terribly for a long while. Everyone was willing to write him off. Frankly, while I was writing this book, I thought he wasn't going to make it. His campaign just was not catching on. But something happened. And I heard a lot of analysts say, well, he got a new organization, and he hired this guy or that guy and started getting more money in. Baloney. There was nothing really very new. What was new was that Benazir Bhutto was killed, assassinated in Pakistan. That was December the 27th. Put it on a calendar, and then look at what happened to John McCain. Because I feel that the American people said, we're still in this war. American people, I think, have a habit of impatience to get out of, everything is old, everything happened a long time ago. And they didn't really feel that that 9/11 was current. They felt it was history, I think. And look, I'm using a very broad brush here. But I also want to say this, that when I say that these issues that we discuss and that we say are the most important, the economy, gas prices, I don't mean to minimize them. I recognize they're important, but there's a time for everything. And in recognizing that there's a time for everything, to me, a nation is like a person. My guess is that practically everyone here has had a time of their life, maybe more than one, probably more than one, where suddenly something happens that you didn't want, you didn't expect, but a crisis happens, either to someone you love or yourself, and it takes precedence so overwhelmingly that everything that you were worried about yesterday means nothing. And you wish, oh God, if I could only have the things I was worried about yesterday, whatever they were, because by this time you've forgotten them, they've become so unimportant. Well, a nation is like a person. And something happened on 9/11. And we have to recognize what happened. And we have to say, no, all those other things we'll argue about later on. That is, even when I see sometimes people who I generally agree with on practically every issue, and they say, but yeah, but he did so-and-so, and he voted for so-and-so, and Feingold McCain and all that. Tough. Too bad. We'll argue about campaign reform later on, campaign finance reform, because it doesn't mean the survival or the non-survival of the United States. It means a continuing political debate. I can live with that. But I can't, nothing, if we lose the war, we have nothing. Nothing. And all of those issues will be decided by an Ayatollah or an imam or a mullah. All of those issues, including campaign finance reform. One of the other things that occurred while I was writing while I was writing the book was the number 2 guy of Al-Qaeda, al-Zawahiri. He said that we will defeat the United States the way it was defeated in Vietnam in 1975, and in Lebanon in 1983, and in Somalia in 1993. And then what happened fairly recently was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who said, we will soon experience a world without the United States. I take those things seriously. I used to do a lot of TV, and I worked with a lot of extremely good people. Almost all of them got death threats. I don't know if you remember Tawny Little. Magnificent, beautiful, just wonderful girl, anchor woman. She was Miss America of 1976 or a bicentennial. She got death threats. I mean, why? Jerry Dunphy had to have bodyguards for, I think it was over a year. But when you're on TV, it happens. And I remember talking to Daryl Gates, who was the chief of police at the time. And I mean, big deal. I don't mean to bring myself into the act, but if you're on television, you get death threats. Don't ask me why. But so I was telling him, and I was almost laughing about it. And he said, take them seriously. And I said, well, my belief is that if anyone wants to kill me, they'll just do it. Why would they send me a letter first? So, and I thought I was being quite logical. And he said, no, take it seriously and always let me know. Get the police department know. And he said, because you never know, it may be a kook. 99 chances out of 100 it's just going to be a kook who writes a letter. But there's always that chance that it isn't and that someone is going to do it. Well, and I realized, of course he was right. And I know how the Secret Service operates. Thousands of threats against the president, but they regard every single one of them as serious. Well, can't we do the same for our nation? These are people who are giving us threats. And beyond that, we all hear on an everyday basis people shouting, chanting, and yelling in the streets in demonstrations in the Mideast, yelling 3 words, death to America. And they mean it. And I remember, I take it back, I don't remember because that was before my time, but I certainly read that people some 8 decades ago ignored Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler. Just ignored it. Well, they shouldn't have. It was what Daryl Gates said, you take it all seriously. And I believe whether it's a person or a nation, you take it seriously. And someone said there was a guy in the House of Commons whose name I don't know, and I don't know if I ever did know it, but who asked Winston Churchill at the very beginning of the war, before we entered it, to explain why he was fighting Hitler, why England was fighting Hitler. And he said, if we stop, you'll find out. And if we stop, we're going to find out. And we did stop 33 years ago in Vietnam. But when I say stop, it isn't this American amnesia. Whenever I talk to people about Vietnam, they don't quite get what happened. They say, well, America left, the U.S. left, and Vietnam fell. I mean, that's just a traditional thinking right now. No. We, in a sense, won the war on January the 27th of 1973. There were Paris Peace Accords signed by the North Vietnamese, by the Viet Cong, by the United States, by South Vietnam. But the important thing is it was signed by North Vietnam, guaranteeing that South Vietnam would have freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, free elections. What we did was plagiarized our own First Amendment and put it in the Paris Peace Accords, all guaranteed. And because President Tu of South Vietnam was quite apprehensive, and justifiably so, that the North Vietnamese would break this agreement, and for it, we'd get our prisoners of war back, and there'd be no more aggression on either side. Because he was worried that they would break it, we promised what is called in the Paris Peace Accords, piece by piece replenishment, If they lost a bullet, we'd give a bullet. If they lost a helicopter, we'd give a helicopter. 1 for 1. Okay, as soon as we signed it, the Soviet Union started on about a 4-to-1 ratio. We kept our word, it would be 1-to-1. It was 2.25 years after that when people who really wanted the war to be won by the United States and the South Vietnamese were celebrating, and a lot of people didn't want it to be won. They were demonstrating with Viet Cong flags. They were unhappy about the Paris Peace Accords. But 2.25 years later, both Cambodia and South Vietnam surrendered. This is, to me, just so darned important because it all keeps on coming back in everything that deals with foreign affairs, and people bring up Vietnam. Okay, what happened in those 2.25 years? Anything important? Yeah. Watergate became a national scandal. President Nixon resigned. Gerald Ford became president. There was then, after he became president on August the 9th of '75, just months to go, a November election, biggest landslide ever for the opposition party. Tremendous landslide. 94th Congress came in. President Ford was, I say this with all the respect, with great respect, he was a caretaker president. He had little, if any, power. The Congress was running the executive office as well as the legislature because it was just so powerful. On important things, there are 11 very important things, his veto was overridden. He couldn't do anything. And on April the 10th, he gave, and I say this date because it's terribly important. On April the 10th of 1975, he gave a speech to a joint session of the Congress, begging, never heard a president beg like this, begging the Congress to please give $972 million so that Cambodia and South Vietnam would not have to surrender. And he was saying it may even be too late for Cambodia. Many of the members of the House of Representatives and a couple of senators walked out of the chamber. That was April 10th. I cite that date because on April the 17th, 1 week after that, Cambodia surrendered. And on April the 30th, Saigon surrendered, South Vietnam. And that night, Senator William Fulbright said, "I am no more distressed than I would be if Arkansas lost a football game to Texas." And that pretty well summed it up. I now find that we have people in the Congress who are trying to do whatever they can to stop funding the battles that we're fighting in the war against terror. I don't want to repeat. In an ironic sense, and I don't know if it was just by coincidence or by design, but the first time that the Senate tried to pass a withdrawal from Iraq, they made the date to start the withdrawal April the 30th of 2008, this year. Well, it didn't pass. But God, when I heard that date, April the 30th, that's the date that Saigon surrendered. Is that intentional? Are they trying to duplicate what that Congress did? Anyway, I mean, I've been talking too long, but I do want to say that this election, you know, everyone always says, this is the most important election. I've heard that ever since I was a little kid. And now I find myself saying it because it is, and because we're in this war. Let me just to tell you, because I know that the title is sort of an unusual one, what Above Empyrean means. I got it from a trip that I took in 1964. Went to refugee centers all around the world and talked to refugees from communist nations. And they were from North Korea, went to risk their lives to get to South Korea, North Vietnam to get to South Vietnam, from Laos and Cambodia, they went to Thailand. From Tibet, they went to Darjeeling in India. From the People's Republic of China, they went to Taiwan, and they went to Hong Kong, which was under the British at the time, and to Macau, that was under Portugal at the time. From East Berlin to West Berlin, from Cuba to Miami, from the Soviet Union and all of the Eastern European satellite countries to countries of the West. These are people risking their lives, taking nothing, really nothing of any value with them, just what they could carry. And after doing this for a few weeks, talking to them for a few weeks, I then made the habit of always asking at the end of our conversation, did you ever see anyone coming the other way? The answer was always no. And sometimes some laughter, as if to say, what a crazy question that is. Of course not. And they didn't actually say that, but that was the sort of the suggestion in their smiles or their laughter at the question. And I just came to realize, when you talk to these people, what they gave up to be free. Imagine just leaving your homes now. It's your home. You see people in tornadoes and hurricanes. God, they don't want to leave these people voluntarily left their home. I was going to say very often, not very often, all the time, risking their lives for this trek to liberty. And I thought, because I had heard the word when I was in school, I don't even remember what, that this was, liberty is Empyrean. Empyrean means the highest heaven. It's ancient Greece. That it was in ancient Greece that they said that Empyrean is the heaven above heaven. Well, that's what they were going to. That's what they were walking to. And I felt that liberty, particularly here in the United States, is above Empyrean. That it is it's on earth. And unlike John, I'm not a theologian, and so I have very little to say about heaven. Except that I know that we have it right here. And that's the meaning of the title, and that's the definition I give in the book. And I talk about the trip, but not in first person, obviously. This is a novel, so I did it through a fictitious character. But that trip has meant a lot to me, and that was in 1964. And that's the meaning of the title. Now, if you have any comments, questions, or anything, let me know that.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll raise your hand, I will bring the microphone to you, and I'll ask you to stand so Bruce can see you.
Thank you. I'm trying to understand
A little bit closer to your mouth.
why in Iraq we are not using more of our air power.
It's a good question. I don't want to talk in terms of military strategist. I'll certainly leave that up to General Petraeus, who certainly knows his stuff. I will say one thing that I find in our fighting of a war, both overseas and what we used to call the home front in World War II. So we're trying to fight a politically correct war. You don't win politically correct wars. No. Look back on how we won World War II. And I needn't itemize the things that we did in World War II, but they were not politically correct. But we won. And it was considered justifiably the greatest generation. And I think that most chiefs of state recognize, all chiefs of state recognize that we have more military power than any other country in the world. They also recognize that we won't use it. Therefore, we're not the most powerful nation in the world, and we better use it. And I also have to look back at the war between Israel and Hezbollah, which I am confident is just in hiatus. It is not over. I'm confident of that, and I think most people are. But it was the first time that I ever saw a war with Israel end in that way, or I should say in intermission this way. Generally, I mean, you go back to the Six-Day War and Yom Kippur War, I mean, Israel does pretty good for itself. I think that what Israel tried to do was do what the United States does, politically correct. That if they wanted to take out terrorist headquarters, which the terrorist headquarters may be intentionally in a neighborhood of civilians, and there's a condo next door, they would make darn sure they got the terrorist headquarters, or they wouldn't even send a missile to it. And I think that's why they tried to play a politically correct war. That isn't the way you win. You win the way they won in 1967. You just go at it. You do whatever is necessary to win. And we have to do whatever is necessary to win, whatever it may be. And let the enemies know that we are willing to do whatever is necessary to win. Yes, sir.
Yes, it just seems as though the pendulum just keeps on swinging wider to the left and to the right as far as which way the mood of the country goes. My parents tell me about World War II. It was a long war, a lot of fatalities and so on, but the country seemed to be, I was not there, but my parents were, they were always united. Through a depression.
Oh, you look old enough to have been there.
I could have been there. A year or two off, but I was too young to remember.
I'm kidding you.
But it just seems like in the information age now that we don't have the time for a war. And so
That's a great phrase.
And so how do you get to the place where we are then united and not in the information age that we will have time for war for victory?
Awfully good question. And we're in a period of time where I have never seen so much information available. I mean, never. There's never been a time. And less known than today. I mean, it's just amazing. Like when I talked about Vietnam, it's just most people don't know what happened. They just say, yeah, America left, the United States left, and it fell. And in terms of this war, and I always have to bridge Vietnam because it always is with this war, there were demonstrations continually, and that's why the Congress voted the way that it did, because they were obeying the demonstrators on the streets rather than our signatures in Paris. Those people who demonstrated are just have duplicated themselves in current times, and it's Iraq rather than Vietnam, and they don't know what happened. What happened is because of those demonstrators at that time that influenced the Congress so much, we did what we did, and we caused more death of Southeast Asians in the first year of the so-called peace than in the decade of war prior to those surrenders of Cambodia and Vietnam. That's the kind of peace that the demonstrators in our Congress attained. Now, I know a lot of, not a lot, but I know some who were demonstrators during that period and really regret it because they know what happened afterwards. And they're marvelous people, and they're courageous, and their conscience ridden. But it's all happening again. We learned nothing. And I don't know what you do. There is so much information available that it gets to be to a point that people disregard the information that they're so easily able to get right now, not only through the internet, but even through television that used to be dominated by 3 networks, and now it isn't, by magazines that now are practically all sides of the political spectrum. We have tremendous amount of information, but we somehow seem to know so little. I don't know. Wish I did.
One of the things that strikes me is the fact, just listening here, we're talking about a war and how we should fight it. But it seems, if we're going to talk about World War II, is one of the things we carried into the present day is a guilt about how the Japanese were treated, the American citizens who were here. And so therefore we have a reluctance to call anything evil or anything wrong.
That's the
I
political
mean,
correctness.
basically, so it's a conundrum almost, is that we call it a war, but really it's an ideology that values the end justifies the means, which we've never faced before. Every religion that came here, for the most part, the Indians certainly had a value system that was somewhat equivalent to the others. And so my question is, how much of this do you think is really an ideology, and how do we fight that war?
There is certainly ideology connected with it. I find that we have too much of a guilt complex. I remember when the Japanese citizens were taken to those camps. I remember I heard not one voice of complaint. And it was the leading liberal, FDR, who did it, and the leading liberal of California, Earl Warren, who did it. I don't remember anyone who complained. No one. I remember the air raids, the air raid wardens, the searchlights at night. We didn't care. We just didn't care. I remember the open groceries. They didn't have doors. They just was open. And the people who worked in produce had badges like about this big. I mean, it was like this that said, "I am Chinese." And there was the belief that it is entirely possible that someone would want to kill someone who was Japanese at that time because of Pearl Harbor. There were any number of reasons given, but not because they had to justify it. It was just the way that it is. And when I look back at those times, there were very unjustified times. Look, I'm Jewish. If Jews around the world were committing terrorism, and every time you heard about a terrorist attack, it was by a Jew, man, I think I'd get out of the religion. I'd be, where's Father John? John, let me talk to you about this. No, I just mean that I don't see the sensitivity. I mean, yeah, I understand the sensitivity, I suppose, but by God, when it comes to the survival of the nation, there are a lot of things that you might have to do because of the circumstances, and you do them. It's all going to be unjust unless you want to be politically correct and lose the war. It will be unjust. There's nothing that you can do to go back and say, gee, isn't that swell? No, it isn't swell. And I feel like, my God, I mean, we're all human beings. You don't want anyone to have to go to a camp and stay there for the duration of the war. It had to be done. I don't know. I don't know. But I just do know that I'm willing to have anything done that has to be done. Got to win. And then we can argue about how terrible we were in the winning. Yes. I'm sorry. No, that's okay. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. That was my mistake because I nodded. I'm sorry. Please go ahead. Then we'll
yes, I just wanted to mention, at the outbreak of World War II in September '39, Neville Chamberlain is reputed to have said, let Hitler not assume that we have lost our moral fiber and we will fight. And it seems to me this country is losing its moral fiber.
I think some are. Of all of the candidates who were running in the primaries, there were 9 Democrats and there were 11 Republicans. 9 Democrats and Ron Paul, who was a Republican, wanted to end the war, all of them. Of the other 10 Republicans used the term win. And right now, the balance is in the Democrats' favor in terms of any poll that's been taken. Certainly for the Congress, and I know these things fluctuate on a day-to-day basis. I don't know what it is tonight, but last night's polls that I saw indicated Barack Obama was ahead. So some within just the zone in which it could go, you know. What do you call that, Jay? Margin of error, and some with some pretty good distance between them. So I don't know, and that's much too early to say. Well, that tells you this, But it looks like at this moment, the nation is more inclined to believe those who say, let's end it. Please.
Who would you like to see as McCain's running mate?
No matter what happens, I don't want him, okay, that's a good question, but I would like, no matter who it may be, I would like him not to announce it until the convention. Ronald Reagan made the mistake of saying he was going to have Richard Schweiker as his vice president before he ever had the nomination. And he didn't get the nomination. Gerald Ford got the nomination. And Richard Schweiker didn't bring one delegate from Pennsylvania. Because the opposition then has the opportunity to oppose both the president and the vice presidential candidate. Don't give them that opportunity. Secondly, no one will watch the Republican convention because there won't be anything to watch for. You have 4 nights of primetime TV. For God's sake, use it. Have some element of surprise. Not say that I'm certainly not giving any advice to the, as you may be able to tell, to the Democrats, but I would say Barack Obama shouldn't do it either. You know, you save an element of interest, and I think you make a mistake in doing it too early. I don't know. I just don't know who he should. I have no advice on who he should choose. No, I don't. Yeah.
Over here on the right.
Yeah, it's a two-pronged question. One is, why has the administration done such a poor job of selling us the truth on this? And secondly, why will they not defy what a victory is? I think the thing that we had going for us in the first Iraq conflict, there was a well-defined victory, get out of Kuwait. But we haven't done a job on selling the American people a clearly defined victory.
Oh, you're just so right. The communications of the White House, with all the respect in the world to President Bush, and boy, I sure give it to him, particularly the fact that we haven't been attacked since 9/11. You know, you got to give the guy credit for that.
Excuse me.
I think there are 2 major areas of communications which just weren't done well by the White House. One of them was exactly what you're saying right now, exactly what you're saying. And let me go to the first one and then back again to the second. The first one was that on the speech that he gave right after 9/11, it was September the 20th, to the joint session of the Congress and to the country. It was a magnificent speech, except he said he wanted you to go back to the lives as you knew them before. Do everything you did before. Travel as you did before. You go to skyscrapers if you did before. Shop like you did before. The only thing he said to do differently is be vigilant. No, don't do anything the way that you did it before. We are in a changed world for a while until we win, and then we go back to the way that it was before. One downfall, not downfall. It's a freak of the calendar. Both Bill Clinton and George W. Bush were born in 1946. That means after the victory of World War II. First presidents who didn't live through it. And they weren't even kids. I mean, they just weren't around at all. So they had never seen a wartime president. Too bad, because they should have, because it stays with you the rest of your life. And a wartime president talks about the war. And it continually doesn't get off on a bunch of other subjects. And that means so much. And it's too bad. Again, I don't mean to be over political, but it's one thing that I think is in defense of John McCain's age. He was a kid, but he did see it. He knows what a wartime president is. And I think that that's important. Second mistake on and you were talking about, but I'm just going to put it in a different framework. The White House Communications Office allowed the phrase, the Iraq War, to be used. The Iraq, was it the France War when we went to Normandy? Did we fight the Germany War and the Italy War and the Ethiopia War and the Norway War? Of course not. This was the European theater of World War II. And Iraq is part of the Mideast theater of the global war against Islamist terrorists. And that's the way it should have been phrased. And as soon as anyone said the Iraq War, you say, no, what are you talking about? they allowed it to the point that now I hear people who, if they just thought about it, would never use that phrase. It's a battleground of this war. And I don't know what the next one is. Maybe Iran. I don't know. But are we then going to call it the Iran war if we do? And that separates it. And the Congress does that intentionally. The Congress had a memo from the House Armed Services Committee telling their people not to ever use the term the global war, because they wanted to separate the Iraq war from the larger war. That was a terrible error. Yeah.
Sir, do you plan that the book will be a big seller in Great Britain due to what's going on
I don't even
there?
predict it's going to be a big seller in the United States. I'm no good at predicting anything like that.
Because of the Muslim buildup, you know.
I see.
there.
I see what you're saying. I don't know. I just don't know what makes people buy books and what doesn't. I'm not good on this, which is why I'm so glad to have Jay Hoffman, who knows more about these things than I do. Yeah.
Mr. Herschensohn, would you please give us your analysis of the Iran issue as it faces our country and Israel?
Sure. It is as dangerous as it could be. The only hope that I have is that we're not using preemptive means because they know, the White House and the Department of Defense knows more than I know. Because I believe that may well be necessary. And if Israel isn't going to do it, and I think they will, but I think if they aren't, we're probably going to have to, unless there's some kind of mammoth change of policy. I don't expect that to happen. We say, well, a lot of the young people, they want to be like the West. Well, they've been saying that ever since the Ayatollah Khomeini took over. I will say this, and President Carter, one of the great mistakes he made, one of the greatest mistakes he made, was abandoning the Shah of Iran, who was a friend to 5 presidents, on the basis of human rights violations, of Savak, the secret police. And so we got the Ayatollah Khomeini. And you may remember that our UN representative said that someday he will be known as a saint, the Ayatollah Khomeini. And the State Department was virtual celebration because Khomeini was in. Forgive me for doing this. You don't even have to forgive me for doing this. But when I'm on Jimmy Carter, he is a professional abandoner. When he came into office, he abandoned Nicaragua to the Sandinistas, El Salvador to the Marxist guerrillas, Iran to the Ayatollah Khomeini, Taiwan to China, and then after leaving office, he abandoned the current president, it was Ronald Reagan at the time, by speaking a tradition of presidents, never to speak publicly against a current sitting president. If you're a former president, you don't do that. Went overseas and talked against the Strategic Defense Initiative of Ronald Reagan. He then, more recently, is certainly abandoning Israel for Hamas and abandoning the United States in the stuff that he says when he's overseas about our president and about our policies. I mean, when I say a professional abandoner, I've never seen anything like it. He for a while he had a reputation of being a great former president, and he was building houses and everything else. And then, I don't know what happened to him. I just don't know what happened to him, but he went back to the abandonment route.
Mr. Herschensohn, you so eloquently quoted President Nixon at the beginning of your speech in our great need to be energy independent. Why was nothing done when there was foresight saying something needs to be done? That was the past. And in your crystal ball, what do you see in the future that we can become?
We keep on
independent?
electing people who will tell you in advance that they're not going to do anything. They're saying, well, you know, we can have those great windmills, and we can have. I mean, we have. So I know all of the stuff that we can have, but why don't we do it? Just yesterday, President Bush made a speech saying that he wants the states to permit offshore oil drilling. And yet I'll listen to these opponents, and they'll say, oh, we're not going to get this for another 20 years. Well, I heard that all the time, or it's going to just be pennies off whatever it would be. I would then say to those people, well, then why don't we stop drilling altogether in the United States? Would you be for that? I mean, we started sometime. I remember the argument, and this was during President Nixon's administration, for the Alaskan pipeline. It started during the Johnson administration. The debate started in 1968. It only took 2 years before the Alaskan pipeline was finally built, to the great debate and opposition of those who called themselves environmentalists. But we got it, and boy, is it good that we did. And I would just say use everything. But you'll find that we keep, when you say, why don't they do it? Because we keep electing those people who will tell us in advance they won't do it. They don't want nuclear. They don't want coal. They don't want shale. They don't want anything. They want to talk about something, gee, we can do this with hybrid cars. Do what we know can be done. They'll say, you can't drill yourself out of this. Yeah, you can. Yes, you can. You can drill yourself out of it.
Hi, Bruce. My topic has to do with intelligence. We need superb, impeccable intelligence to prevent attacks on our homeland and to win the war on terror.
Right.
So, what can you tell us that we haven't heard in the news or in the magazines and newspapers and the periodicals? What has the CIA done, or how have they infiltrated the terrorists, or what have they been doing around the world to overcome the terrorists?
Truthfully, let me answer the question, but let me then do something in a little bit more depth. I don't know, and if I did know, I wouldn't tell you. Okay, right. But I will say this about our intelligence capabilities. It used to be that we were one of the 3 greatest intelligence agencies in the world, and everyone knew it. It was the CIA, it was MI6 of Great Britain, and Mossad of Israel. KGB wasn't even on the list of the Soviet Union. The reason it wasn't on the list is because it was so easy to spy on free countries. They'd get a room at the Mayflower Hotel in Washington, D.C. and read the Washington Post, and they were pretty good spies. We were, and then, remember I told you, I mentioned the 94th Congress that voted for no funds for Vietnam, and it was that landslide victory that came right after Watergate. Same Congress. As soon as they came into session in 1975, formed the Frank Church Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. And on February the 27th of 1975, Frank Church said that he was releasing the oath of office that CIA agents take, and they should testify to the committee on those things that they had held secret. Many of the CIA agents resigned. Some of them were lucky enough to have retirement, or they were able to take early retirement, but some of them testified. In a very short period of time, names of CIA agents were known all over the world. They were published, publications. There was one called Liberacion. There was one called Covert Action, magazines. A guy named Richard Welch, his name was revealed in the hearing and then in Covert magazine. He was our station chief in Athens. I said assistant to the ambassador, station chief, CIA agent. On December the 23rd of 75, 2 days before Christmas, he was walking from a Christmas party and he was assassinated. Our CIA operatives, who were local in nature, foreign nationals, diminished by 93% by the end of that year. 93%. They were risking their lives for the United States, but they're not going to risk their lives if the United States press is going to kill them. And the Senate of the United States forms a committee that reveals names. And I understand that. That has gone from generation to generation about what the 94th Congress did, to the point that a father isn't going to tell his son to work for the CIA. He's going to say, work for MI6, work for the French, work for any number of intelligence agencies. Don't do it through the United States. And it is the major reason why we have, right after 9/11, an intelligence coalition, because a lot of our friends will never reveal names, but they will be friendly with us and let us know the intelligence that we don't know, because we don't have that kind of local support that we used to enjoy. Too bad. But President Bush had a call for an intelligence coalition of friendly nations. Yeah.
Bruce, thank you very much. We owe you a great debt of gratitude for being a great American.
Thanks. Thank you.
A question, and kind of a toughie, because we don't know the mind of George Bush. But
I beg your
Bush-
pardon?
I said this is kind of a toughie, because we don't know the mind of George Bush.
Okay.
But Bush ran as a compassionate conservative. Yet on the border issue with Ramos and Campione rotting in jail in solitary confinement,
Agree with you.
it absolutely blows my mind that they have not been pardoned.
I agree with you.
Do you have any insight into that
I
whole
don't.
thing?
I don't. There's a lot of things that I regret about a lot of people that I like.
Yeah.
It's just, no two human beings are the same. I can't defend that. I cannot defend his action or lack of action on those two men.
Sir, I'm a Vietnam veteran.
Are you?
What's happening with Afghanistan?
With what?
Afghanistan.
It looks like a revival of a good many of the Taliban. There was a prison break, as you know, in Kandahar. And I've also heard some reports that it is not anywhere near as bad as has been stated, and that they believe that Kandahar can be brought under control in short time. No way for any of us to know. I do want to say one thing that, I wish, in the book I do have the use of nuclear weapons. John and I were talking about this. I think we have to give the perception that we're not afraid to use them. There is an area called Waziristan where probably Obama is. Osama bin Laden. Well, I knew it was going to happen someday. I knew it was going to happen someday. I'm glad it happened this day rather than some other day. But we know, we don't, I shouldn't say we know, but we have a pretty good idea where he probably is in the Waziristan area. It is very unpopulated. I know that someday we're going to have to let people know we will use it. So we better figure out a place that is not heavily populated with innocent people, where it might not be a bad idea to use it. And this is not, I know how this sounds, but practically every president since Truman has thought of the possibility of using a nuclear weapon in a crisis in which we were engaged. Didn't do it, but thought of it. But I know now that the perception is that we'd never use it no matter what. And I think that we have to. I might say something else about the Taliban. I've read any number of times that if it wasn't for Reagan, there wouldn't be a Taliban. That he gave aid to the Taliban. There was no such thing as the Taliban when he was even in the White House. The Taliban started. We gave aid to what was called the Mujahideen, and they broke off into different groups. Some of them became Taliban. Some of them became the Northern Alliance, our friends. But it wasn't, the Taliban started in Pakistan in 1994, and they didn't take over Jalalabad and Kandahar until, and I got to give you the date, 9/11 of 96. That was when they took over Jalalabad, at that time the second most important city. And they have a thing about anniversaries. And that was 9/11 of 96. And then a couple of weeks later, they took over Kabul, the biggest city. And that was the Taliban. And it had nothing to do with President Reagan. But may I just say one other thing in talking about presidential power in contrast to congressional power. Shortly after Vietnam and Cambodia surrendered, I asked former President Nixon, what would you do if you were still in the White House and the Congress wouldn't give you that money to save both Vietnam and Cambodia? And he said, I'd about the blazes out of Hanoi and Haiphong. And he said, I'd probably get impeached. But so what? Would have saved thousands of Southeast Asian lives, and then he corrected himself. Said millions of Southeast Asian lives. And that's what a president can do. True, be impeached, doesn't have the funds to do it, but he isn't going to give the orders to a commanding general and have the general say, no, I'm not going to do it. I read that the Congress didn't appropriate enough money. Yeah.
Some of the people are saying that the Democrats are going to win in a landslide coming up. Why don't the Republicans stand up and come out with a list like Newt Gingrich did? You know, we're going to drill.
I agree.
We're going to drill for
agree.
oil.
No,
We're going to build a fence that you guys promised in Congress that you were going to do.
Yep.
We're going to do this
No, I
and
agree.
that.
It would certainly be the
But
wise thing to do.
they don't sound like they're standing up for anything. But the Republicans, and they are going to get beat if they don't stand up and say something.
Totally agree with you. Yes, sir. Oh, go, please. Whatever you want to do, John, my friend over here.
Okay. The decision by the U.S. Supreme Court on Guantanamo Bay is a slap in the face to any American who's worn a uniform. And if I might quote Michelle Obama, whose husband has been to all 57 states, by the way. For the first time in my life, I'm ashamed to be an American.
No, don't do that.
I'm angry and I'm mad. And you know, Bruce, we do owe a lot to you. And it's our loss that you're not our U.S. Senator.
Thanks.
It's America's loss. And you are a hero to many of us. And I'm sure, like a lot of my friends and many people here tonight, I have a long face. I'm angry, I'm mad, I'm losing hope. And I miss the great communicator. I miss Ronald Reagan.
Sure.
You know, the shining city on a hill. Sure. You know, on that bell curve, it seems like America's on the lower side now of that. And
like I said, don't be ashamed. This was a very quirky Supreme Court decision because I feel it was unconstitutional, and it was I mean, I'm just talking legally right now, as far as moral, totally immoral. Well, of course. I mean, certainly. I mean, the decision is just god awful whether it was unconstitutional or constitutional, but it was unconstitutional. Supreme Courts rarely want to get into any arguments between the executive and the Congress. Rarely. They wouldn't even take up the War Powers Resolution. That's an argument for you guys to decide on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue. We don't want to get into it. In this case, this thing came up years ago. Well, you remember when it's been with us ever since Guantanamo's been used this way. And the Supreme Court said, well, it's usual. We don't want to get into this. You, the Congress, and the executive branch work together to find a solution to those things that bother the Congress. They did. They came up with it. And then the Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to do it. We're going to give our own opinion. And it is a, well, actually, I have no more to say than what Judge Scalia said. He wrote a magnificent opinion in opposition and ended it. I believe it was near the ending, at least, was saying that this will cost American lives. And of course it will.
Bruce, we have time for one more question over here on the left, unfortunately.
Hi, Mr. Herschensohn. It's an honor. I've been
No.
watching you on TV since I was a little kid, so it's nice to be here tonight. Well, no, maybe that's the wrong thing to say. I'm just curious, and this is kind of a vague question, but how will we know when we've won the war against terrorism? How would you define that?
How
Or
would
what
you
should
know?
we look for to know that?
Tell you,
that we've done it?
I think I could tell you. You could be able to walk in a federal building without emptying your purse or your pockets. You're able to go on an airplane without taking off your shoes. You'll be able to do all those things that are now dim in my memory before 9/11. And terrorism, although I don't expect it to disappear, I expect it to be a crime, not a war. In other words, it isn't being led by some international organization. It is a crime. It's some jerk who is a terrorist. But each act would be criminal, as it was in the in Oklahoma City. We're going to have things like that. That's unfortunately the way it is. But it will not be a war, and you wouldn't be able to look at any particular group and say that they're doing this on a worldwide basis. That's how we'd know. And I don't ever want to say that 9/11 has changed us forever, because it shouldn't change us forever. It should change us until we win, and then things should go to what we used to consider to be normalcy, and that's how we know. Also, the people so often say that look, you can't get a piece of paper signed. Well, show me the paper at the end of the Cold War. Anyone here know the date that we recognize as a holiday that the Cold War ended? There was no date. There is no paper. And some wars end in different ways. But there's no question that it not only ended, we won the Cold War. And I'll tell you how we know. And I'll tell you how we know it. There is no Soviet Union. Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, for an extraordinary tour of the world, let us once again thank Bruce Herschensohn. I have a brief presentation. The acting president in Bruce's book is named Eli Jared. He is handsome, silver-haired, very debonair. When Eli Jared is in the hospital, like Bruce Herschensohn, he refuses to wear a hospital robe. You can do that. You can say to the nurse and doctors, I want to get dressed and sit in the chair and not be wearing that embarrassing robe that's flapping open in the back. Bruce won't wear one in the hospital. Eli Jared won't wear one in the hospital. I accuse Bruce of patterning this handsome, debonair former diplomat who saved civilization on himself. He told me I was wrong. He was patterned on director John Ford.
John Ford. I imagined him in this circumstance. I got to, and that's what I.
So when you read Above Empyrean, think John Ford, but also think Bruce Herschensohn as well. He is always immaculately dressed, and we're sending away not to make a partisan statement, but here's a Nixon Library tie with elephants.
Wonderful.
Our thanks to Bruce and to all of you. He will meet you in the Sandy in the museum store. Where's Sandy? Yeah. Where do we meet? In the museum store to sign your copies of Above Empyrean. Thanks for coming. God bless America. Drive carefully.